Hi, my name is Shannon Adams, and I'm going to tell you a story today about a little girl named Very Little Red Riding Hood. This story is based on the fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood. Only there's a little spin to the story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl. Her name was Very Little Red Riding Hood. And Very Little Red Riding Hood was getting ready to go visit her grandmother. "Hi, Mommy, I have cakes," said Very Little Red Riding Hood. "I have cakes, and I'm going to see Grandmama." And Mommy said, "I know, Very Little Red Riding Hood. Now don't be too hard with Grandmama." "Yes, Mama, I won't be hard with Grandmama." So Very Little Red Riding Hood set off with her cakes. She put on her red cloak and she headed through the woods. Na 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 na, na 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 na. So, as Very Little Red Riding Hood was going through the woods, she stopped to smell all the beautiful flowers. And then out jumped a wolf. "Hi, little girl." "Oh, a foxy," said Very Little Red Riding Hood. And the wolf said, "Where are you headed?" And Very Little Red Riding Hood said, "I'm going to Grandmama's. I have cakes." And the wolf said, "Can I come too?" Very Little Red Riding Hood said, "No, get away from me." Well, then the wolf said he tried another thing. So he asked Very Little Red Riding Hood, "Would you like to pick some flowers, some yellow flowers for Grandmama?" And Very Little Red Riding Hood said, "No, no yellow flowers, red flowers for Grandmama." So Very Little Red Riding Hood and Foxy, which is what she called them, picked some red flowers for Grandmama. And once they finished picking their red flowers, they headed down to Grandma's house. Na 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 na, tra la la la. Once Very Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf arrived at Grandmama's, there was a knock at the door. Grandmama came to the door. "Hi, Little Red, come right in." But then, and only then, it was when Grandmama saw the wolf that she screamed, "Ah, help! A wolf is at the door." And then Very Little Red Riding Hood reassured her Grandmama, "No, Granny, that's just Foxy. He's no harm." But still, Grandmama wouldn't let Foxy in the house. So Very Little Red Riding Hood came in the house with Grandmama, and they began to do things. Very Little Red Riding Hood said, "Grandmama, I have cakes just for you." And Grandmama said, "Great, would you like tea?" And Very Little Red Riding Hood said, "Yes, Grandmama." And as the wolf peeked through the window, Very Little Red Riding Hood said, "Would you like tea too, Foxy?" And Grandma said, "He can't come in here. He's a wolf." And Foxy said, "Oh, he won't do us any harm." So she let the wolf in the house. Well, then, Very Little Red Riding Hood, Grandmama, and the wolf began to have tea. And they drank their tea warm. And they had cakes. And then they played. And then they danced. And then they laughed. And then they played some more and danced some more. Until finally, Grandmama and the wolf started to get tired. And the wolf said, "I'm tired." Because they drew and they did all sorts of things after their tea. And then Grandmama said, "Yes, I'm getting a little tired too, Mr. Foxy," which is what Very Little Red Riding Hood called the wolf. So then they decided, "Maybe we should all take a nap," said Grandmama. But Little Red Riding Hood noticed one person was missing. She looked around. "I want my mommy. I don't see my mommy." And at that time, that's when Very Little Red Riding Hood began to cry. "I want my mommy. Where's my mommy?" and nothing could calm Very Little Red Riding Hood. Grandma tried hugs, and she tried the little Miss Red Teddy that Very Little Red Riding Hood bought with her. She tried a story. She tried more hugs, but she couldn't comfort Very Little Red Riding Hood. Very Little Red Riding Hood continued to cry, "Ah, ah, I want my mommy." So then Mr. Fox, Grandma said to Mr. Fox, maybe you can try. So Mr. Fox said, "Okay, Very Little Red Riding Hood, I, I know a story. Oh, what great big eyes you have." And Very Little Red continued to cry. "Ha, ha." And then he said, "Oh, what big cheeks you have." And Very Little Red kept crying. "Ha, ha." And he said, "Oh, what big tears you have." And then he said, "And I'm going to tickle, tickle, tickle you." And Very Little Red Riding Hood began to laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh until finally she fell asleep. And she stayed asleep. So finally, Grandmama and Foxy the Wolf decided to lay down and take a nap too. And they all slept very happily ever after. And that's the end of the Very Little Red Riding Hood story. And the thing about the Very Little Red Riding Hood is that even though it was the fox who's usually the guy who everybody's afraid of and does things and everybody has to do things to get away from him, this time it was Very Little Red Riding Hood who ran the show.